Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money, I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. The clashes between ELAS and EDES caught by surprise guerrillas and senior cadres alike, many of whom were still at a loss to understand why they started killing each other. A few days after the outbreak of hostilities, a senior EDES member noted in his diary, quote, "We have no clear information. The GHQ sends us regularly some badly written circulars and orders hoping to galvanize the people against EAM. However, the people do not really believe that they are in danger from EAM, and read these circulars with a notable apathy and calmness. I haven't been able to understand why we declared war myself, even though I am constantly in contact with the GHQ. They claim that EAM has proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, I highly doubt if 1 in 100 EAM members really know what this means." Such feelings abounded on the other side as well, with an ELAS guerrilla from Epeiros recounting in his memoir, quote, "The whole excitement of being a guerrilla, a liberator, was gone. Enthusiasm was gone. Songs were gone and were succeeded by despondency and gloom. The guerrillas marched with their heads down and most were tortured by a single question. Why did we really join up? In the morning, our platoon was less than half since many have deserted." Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Diogenes Lamp podcast, the Greek Civil War segment, episode 38, Government in the Mountains and the Middle East Mutiny. That little snippet there, that passage was from Dr. Spyros Tsoutsoumpis' book, The People's Army. Great book, of course, I use it as a source when I write these episodes. Also, Dr. Spyros Tsoutsoumpis just came out with another book, ELAS and EDES, The People's Army of the Resistance. It looks great. I've been able to dabble through it a bit. It is in Greek. That's why I say I've been able to dabble through it a bit. He should have an English version out soon. Either way, I'm going to put a link in the show notes for the book for any of my people that have Greek good enough to really get into it. I would highly recommend. Can't say this enough, and this is something I intend to do at the start of each and every episode. And that is to give you guys a big shout out, a big thank you. Thank you to the listeners. Seriously, you make this possible. Huge thank yous to big thank yous, huge shout outs. You get an idea what I'm saying. Big thanks to my Patreons, Rongta Wu, Elephantarchis, Megas Yorgos, is a Zoarcho, Expat Frank, Darth Mater, None Taken Podcast, Taxiarchos. I know I say this every episode, but again, thank you for your financial support. It makes a huge difference. This isn't free. I have not hit the lotto. I'm just a regular Joe like a lot of you across the world. I have not inherited extreme wealth. So this is a hobby more than anything else. But in this hellscape that we live in today, I mean, it could be worse. It's not like 1944 Civil War Europe, of course, right? Civil War Greece. But in this society of extreme wealth inequality and other societal ills, let's put it that way, things like this cost money. And yeah, so you guys paying, giving me money, which in a nutshell is the most basic sign and of way to show your support, right? Because ultimately, time is money. It makes a big difference, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I know that was a word salad there, but it makes a big difference. Thank you so much. All my Patreons, I think there's still one Patreon left. I really got to mail that book out. But so far, if you are a Patreon member, I mail you a book, usually either for Pascha, for Easter, or for Christmas. The value or the cost of the book depends on how high your ranking is, whether you're giving $5, $10, or $20 a month or whatever the case. Books like Hezbollah by Augustus Richard Norton, books by Nikos Kazantzakis, which I love a lot, books by Andrei Platonov, like The Foundation Pit, books like Greek Fire, Poison Arrows, and Scorpion Bombs by Adrian Mayer, stuff like that. Guns, Germs, and Steel, Why Nations Fail, that kind of stuff. I like that kind of stuff. So if you guys like those kinds of books too, I'll mail you something like that once a year. For now, that's kind of the most that I'm able to organize for the Patreon thing. But I got to thank you guys somehow, so that's how I can show you thanks. Of course, as always, if you're listening to this, you think I made a mistake on anything, shoot me a message either on Instagram or Patreon. If you have any suggestions, stuff like that, I appreciate the feedback. So, on last episode, we zoomed in on the SOE's and the Foreign Office's mad scramble to stop the Antarctico from eating itself, which culminated in the PEEA Agreement, which formally ended what is called the first round of the Greek Civil War. We are now in March of 1944. The PEEA Agreement, signed at PEEA Bridge, was not a perfect agreement. It didn't solve the national schism that had plagued Greece in one way or another since at least World War I. Not even close. But it had stopped the killing, temporarily. That was about it, though. In a lot of ways, we could look at it as a missed opportunity more than anything else. An opportunity to really put a damper on the whole EAM'S, ELAS, KKE movement, or at least moderate it a bit. Instead, though, the British policy of stubbornly insisting on the king would only enable a more radical position. But, hey, let's hear it from historian Haris Vlavianos, who really lays it out nice and neatly in his book, Greece, 1941 and 1949, From Resistance to Civil War, and, quote, to conclude, Churchill's and the Foreign Office's stubborn support for the king and their policy of trying to sell George II to a reluctant populace could only have favored the KKE and EAM, who had made the issue of the king their major propaganda theme. Had the British government disassociated itself at an early stage from the royal cause, it would have done much to weaken the psychological hold of the communists over the Republican camp. In the event of Churchill's strong preference for monarchical institutions, sometimes verging on obsession, and the continuous feuds between the Foreign Office and the SOE, assisted EAM'S effort on the basis of Republican and anti-British stance to become the largest and most powerful resistance organization in Greece. And again, that's from historian Haris Vlavianos. That really is it, right, guys? There you have it. If you take one thing away from that, I think the part where he talks about the Foreign Office's stubborn support for the king and their policy of trying to sell King George to a reluctant populace. Don't forget that part. Also, don't forget from last episode how the king outright rejected a proposal for a provisional committee to help form a government of national unity. The king would go on again to reject the proposal on March 10th, with, of course, Churchill's blessing, and with the denial of any possible sensible solution that could have taken into account the sentiment of the Greek people who had already endured so much for the sake of the resistance to the occupiers On the same day that the king rejected once again the proposal for a regency and a committee to establish a government of national unity that could then decide when and if the king should return, on that same day, EAM formally announced the creation of the Political Committee of National Liberation, or the PEEA, because we love our acronyms, people, right? Which, in a nutshell, was a government that EAM had created its own national government, really. That's what the PEEA was. And it was created to rival the government in exile. But the committee consisted not only of EAM members. It also consisted of people like Alexander Svolos, who was one of Greece's top constitutional experts, Angelos Angelopoulos, an academic, Emmanuel Mandakas, the only senior Greek army officer to attempt a coup against the Metaxas regime in 1938, and Euripides Bakirtzis, if I'm saying that correctly, who had left Ekoukoua and joined the new PEEA. And of course, we also had Tsiantos, who was the general secretary of the Koukoua, the KKE, and thus, obviously, a communist. While the PEEA had a broad umbrella and several non-communist elements, Tsiantos controlled the Department of the Interior, Mandakas the Department of Defense, and what this really meant was that between these two department heads, much of the PEEA's real power, like control of ELAS and OPLA, which was another small secret paramilitary/death squad, was still in the hands of EAM, and thus the KKE. Now, this wasn't just an out-of-the-blue thing. After all, forming a government to rival a government in exile under the promotion and support of the British isn't something you could just do on a Tuesday morning, right? And while the PEEA had indeed been a shock to many, it had been in the cards for a while, really since the failed Cairo Conference in August of 1943. In December of 1943, a call was put out by EAM to all political parties to form a government of, quote, national unity in free Greece. And 1 month later, on January 10th of 1944, at the 10th plenum of the KKE's Central Committee, EAM's proposal was endorsed and negotiations with various resistance groups began with the intention of forming what would become the PEEA. And keep in mind, remember, this was already one of the demands of EAM during the Plaka negotiations, a demand that was denied. Also keep in mind that EAM's partisan brothers in the north, in Yugoslavia, they too had already created their own PEEA equivalent in November 1943, the Anti-Fascist Council of National Liberation, or the AVNOJ, the AVNOJ, let's call it. But a big difference between AVNOJ and the PEEA was that AVNOJ was a provisional government. PEEA was an administrative body, meaning it could turn into not just a government that rivaled the government in exile, but the government. Thus, the announcement of the PEEA really lit a fire under the asses of the king and everyone else of the government in exile that was over in Cairo. The PEEA operated similarly to what regions under EAM's control already did, in that they provided services that a government provides, but in the context of Nazi-occupied Greece, which obviously makes things more complicated. And so, now with a semi-legit government announced, the PEEA did what any legit government would do: elections. And so on April 9th, the PEEA organized free elections throughout the regions that the PEEA ruled via secret ballot, which came out to cover over 1/2 of the entire country, which is pretty sizable. The elections would be specifically for the creation of a national council, 202 delegates from all around Greece, 22 of whom were actually from the 1936 parliament. EAM claimed that 1.5 million took part, which was more than those that had voted in the last free elections in 1936. Take that with a grain of salt. That number came from EAM, of course. But what did elections in Nazi-occupied Greece actually look like? It's not like this is something that was being carried out in front of the Nazis, right? In broad daylight. It only took place in PEEA-controlled Greece. So what did it really look like? So, even the idea of elections in Axis-occupied Greece sounds outlandish, and it sounded outlandish to KKE members as well. like the KKE member Kostas Despotopoulos, who was a legal advisor to ELAS. He was told by Tsoutsoumpis to draft some guidelines for an election, to which he responded, and, quote, "You're joking." But when another KKE member, a Mr. Porphyrogiannis, heard this, he berated him and said, quote, "Do you think we invited you to draw up a decree, an electoral law like that which we're used to? No. We'll have revolutionary elections, as we're under occupation. We won't call the voters to the ballot box. We'll go ourselves to their national council. You want them? You like them? Sign." As we'll see, the election had little in common with elections during peace times. Duh, right? House by house, teams of EAM members delivered paper ballots with instructions. Then they would come back later and pick up the completed ballots. Illiterate villagers could ask anybody to help them vote. The voter had the ability to change the names on the list, but as we know, write-ins virtually never win. As a result, candidates selected by EAM won in a landslide. So not the most legit election in that respect, but there was something special about all of this. Also, for the first time in Greek history, Greek election history, women were allowed to vote. Yes, it was the communist-controlled EAM that gave women the right to vote. As I already mentioned, EAM candidates won the overwhelming majority of seats, but not all EAM members belonged to the KKE, as we know. And thus, there were instances of royalists and liberals running, although they almost always lost. Something else worth mentioning about this election is that the election had proved to break the stranglehold that lawyers and doctors had on the electoral system. Not too different than our political situation today. Lawyers tended to be overrepresented in parliament and local government, but with this election, a wide swath of candidates from all walks of life rose to positions of power. Farmers, priests, laborers, artisans, and journalists. And that was the election of the PEEA. Somewhat legit, but we shouldn't romanticize it, of course. At the end of the day, the government in the mountains was a serious rival to the government in exile in Cairo. And some people, primarily Prime Minister Tsoutsoumpis, saw this for what it was and tried to convince the king to compromise, to take the wind out of the movement like we've talked about time and time again. But he refused, again. And this, combined with the creation of the PEEA and its elections, will lead to more drama, but this time not within occupied Greece, but outside of it. It's been a while since we've touched on the Greek military. We've been in contact a bit more with the Greek government in exile, the Prime Minister Tsoutsoumpis, King George II, but we haven't crossed paths with the official remnants of the Greek military. So let's go ahead and revisit those fellas, turn back the clock a bit to the end of May 1941, and get a better feel for the internal politics of the Greek government in exile. As we know, it was at this time that Crete fell to the Germans, that the king with Prime Minister Tsoutsoumpis made it out to Alexandria and then to Cairo, and other allied forces that could made it off of Crete. Those who couldn't were either captured, killed, or fled to the mountains to hide. Many others made it out of the mainland through neutral Turkey, and thus into the Middle East, which was controlled by the British at the time. We ran into one of these contingents earlier in episode 13, when Major General Zizis and his Evros Brigade and his 2,000 men crossed into Turkey in April of 1941. They were all disarmed, officers included, and thrown into appalling conditions that resembled more like a prison camp. Zizis, out of pride and humiliation, made sure to shoot himself in the head before giving his firearm to the Turks. But his 2,000 men were able to fight another day, which is cool. All in all, several thousand soldiers made it out. As for the Navy, by the end of 1942, there were around 350 officers, and 5,800 petty officers and men made it to Egypt as well. And really by the start of 1943, multiple brigades and battalions had been reformed. So not insignificant in a fight that was as close as the North African theater was. So there's the armed forces. Let's have a recap of the Greek government in exile. We have Tsoutsoumpis, Venizelos as the prime minister, and King George King George II, I should say, at the head of the monarchy. Again, I repeat, Venizelos prime minister ruling with the king. Just hearing that should raise some eyebrows from you guys. And while we're on this topic, I think it's best we rewind a bit and revisit the political cleavages that were alive and well in the Greek army and the Greek government in exile, and how some of them came to be. We're not going back that far, but I just want to remind you guys of the consequences of the failed 1935 Republican coup that left the armed forces almost completely purged of Venizelos and Republican elements. That's really important, because when the big no happened, as in when Metaxas told Mussolini to go fuck himself in October of 1940, well, it was the monarchists that took all the glory. Think of generals like Alexandros Papagos, who got all the fame, versus other well-known and famous generals like Plastiras, who was sidelined. This would obviously cause even more resentment from Venizelos towards monarchists. After the German Blitzkrieg and the fall of Greece in April of 1941, the first officers and generals to make it to Egypt and link up with the government in exile were monarchists. And as a result, it was the monarchists that got a lot of the top positions in the military. But Tsouderos, being the Venizelos he was, and with the aim of building reconciliation within the armed forces, started to reinstate Venizelos officers, the most famous example being the Army's Supreme Commander, General Emmanuel Tsanakakis, who was a Venizelos. But as we know, the Royalists and the Liberals, aka Venizelos, would not get along anyways. None of this would really do anything to mend anything. If they would have gotten along, then I wouldn't be running a historical segment on this podcast called The Greek Civil War, right? So yeah, Liberals, aka Venizelos, and monarchists, aka Royalists, aka Conservatives, stayed separated. They hung out in different lunchrooms, different clubs. They didn't get along. And the monarchists soon enough developed their own secret military society called Nemesis. What a name. Which they then used to threaten the government with mass resignations if their political opponents, the Venizelos, were not all dismissed. In response to Nemesis, liberals, aka Republicans, aka Venizelos, created their own society called the Anti-Fascist Military Organization, or the ASO for short. ASO had chapters in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, and their primary goal was twofold. One, to purge the military of royalists who did not support the war effort, kind of expected when you remember the national schism is still hot, and two, to bring a Republican government to Greece when it was liberated, not a royalist government. ASO members came from a wide swath of flavors on the political spectrum, from the standard liberal Venizelos to Republican to communism, which one of the bigger movers of the ASO was a communist, Yannis Salas. He had escaped from the notorious Acropolis prison camp in 1941 and joined the Royal Hellenic Army of the Middle East, or VESMA, which is the official term, which going forward I'm going to use VESMA when referring to the Greek forces in exile. Keep in mind, though, that VESMA was essentially controlled by the British and the British War Office, and the Foreign Office were no dummies, and they were concerned with momentum of forces that were splintering and working within VESMA. Moving on in our timeline to March of 1942, and Panayotis Kanellopoulos just arrived in Cairo. We remember Kanellopoulos as one of the guys who got busted after the Atkinson debacle, who had to flee as a result of his cover getting blown because Atkinson wrote down everyone's name he ever met, yada yada yada. That was episode 26 if you want to give it a listen, right? May of that year, Kanellopoulos was promoted to Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister and got to work immediately with making organizational improvements in the armed forces. He was considered an innocent politician with honorable intentions, but that isn't always a good thing in politics. Installed a couple of Venizelos in the command of the 1st and 2nd Brigade, court-martialed some officers of Nemesis, and he took a lot of credit for the huge contribution that the 1st Brigade made in the Battle of El Alamein. But just like we said earlier, being innocent, honorable, and especially competent isn't always a good thing in politics. In fact, more often than not, it makes you a target. And that's exactly what happened to Kanellopoulos. The king considered him too liberal, the royalists saw him as an enemy after he tried to crack down on Nemesis, and even the 1st and 2nd Brigades, who he had formerly put Venizelos in command of, became his enemy when he then placed both of them under the command of General Zigouris, who was a conservative and a hero of the war in Albania. The final straw came when Kanellopoulos went after the liberals and the ASO. In response, the ASO presented Gerolymatos with the demand that he purge the army of reactionary elements and install a more veteran Venizelos politician, Mr. G. Roussos, and another Republican officer, Byron Karapanagiotis. Gerolymatos now found himself with no friends, and with mounting criticism from both the left and the right, he submitted his resignation in March of 1943. But who took Gerolymatos' job? Job positions, I should say, after all, right? He had two positions. He was the Minister of Defense and the Deputy Prime Minister. So who took those jobs? The two exact guys that the ASO wanted to be installed in those positions. Roussos became Deputy Prime Minister, and Karapanagiotis became the Minister of Defense. As with every political organization, the more left-wing elements within the ASO weren't satisfied with this seemingly win. As with every political organization, the more hardcore elements within the ASO weren't satisfied. But Salas, the communists, wanted to be patient, and, quote, I am aware that a government with only centrist elements after the revolutionary action of the anti-fascist forces is a rightist deviation. However, a leftist deviation would be the equivalent of a leap into chaos. A rightist deviation would give you the chance to return to the right track. People like Karapanagiotis were more hardline, and they tried to prod Salas into forcing the resignation of Tsoutsoumpis, the prime minister. But Salas told Karapanagiotis no, and that he wouldn't be convinced on provoking the British. And so, moving on in our story to August of 1943, a plane arrives from mainland Greece. And looky here, it's the Cairo delegation that we covered back in episode 34. As we know, this delegation included a variety of Antarctical representatives. Most notably for us, there was the EAM representative Zimas. Who remembered Zimas? Zimas, he was the guy that Woodhouse had noted as the most ablest of communist intellectuals, someone he genuinely enjoyed talking with. As we know, the delegation ended in disaster because the delegates requested that the king not return until the issue of the monarchy was settled. Something we didn't cover in episode 34, though, was that the EAM representatives also reached out to the ASO and specifically told them not to do anything that would provoke the British. Do not provoke the British. But, as we'll see, all of this would come to a head with the announcement of the PEEA on March 10th. And then, on March 31st, shit would really hit the fan in what is known as the Middle East Mutiny. The Middle East Mutiny, we could say, was the result of several things. One we already mentioned, the announcement of the PEEA. Another significant thing was that Tsoutsoumpis was unable to persuade the king to appoint a regent and wait for a plebiscite before he returns to Greece. And so, on that morning of March 31st, a delegation of another group, this one called the National Military Liberation Organization, or the EASDO, submitted a memorandum to Tsoutsoumpis to form a government based on the principles of the PEEA. The members of this group, the EASDO, were promptly arrested. It was at this point that the ASO mobilized and forced the resignation of Tsoutsoumpis, who was replaced by Sophocles, always a badass first name, Venizelos, an obviously significant last name. Some thought that the clout of Venizelos could get things settled down. After all, he was a Venizelos, right? But the Venizelos name proved completely useless, even though he was the son of Eleftherios Venizelos. And so, now in April, the mutiny spread to several brigades and Greek naval units, with Salas taking the lead and spreading the mutiny as far and wide as he could. The mutineers declared allegiance to the PEEA and, of course, defied orders from the superiors. The only notable exception of a military unit that did not mutiny was the Sacred Battalion, which we'll talk more about them later. Just a fun fact as well, something I thought that was interesting. The 1st Brigade that mutinied, they were just getting ready to take part in the Allied offensive in Italy. So this mutiny had direct consequences, direct impacts, let's say, to the Allied war effort. Churchill would refer to these mutineers as, quote, banditti who are masquerading as the saviors of their country. And on April 7th, the British formally assumed all command of the 20,000-strong Greek forces, the Vesma, And on April 16th, Admiral Cunningham threatened repeatedly that he would sink all ships of the Greek fleets within 5 minutes. That is, unless the Greeks themselves quelled the mutiny. Thankfully, though, and finally, on April 22nd, a General Vougaris, Venizelos' new commander-in-chief, organized boarding parties and was able to get mutinied ships boarded and taken care of and subdued one by one. The next day, the soldiers of the 1st Brigade, who by now had donned ELAS insignia on their uniforms, surrendered, as they had been surrounded by the British for 18 days. Was there a chance that Venizelos would have formed a new government and given in to the demands of the ASO? Perhaps. Historian Vlavianos speculates so, but it wouldn't matter, as Venizelos was convinced to step down by the British in order to make way for the George Papandreou, a center-left anti-communist who will come to play a big part in our story going forward as the new Prime Minister of the Greek government in exile. And that's it for today, everyone. Join us next time as we continue our march on to 1944, towards the end of 1944, and also towards the start of what will be known as the second round of the Greek Civil War. Take care. Ήσουν η αδυναμία μου.